Hey, Jay Carper here from American Torah, and I'm reading from Matthew 4, verses 23 to 25. But before I go on, I want to give you just a short geography lesson on uh, the region of Judea, Samaria, Galilee. So, in the early first century, the land of Israel and the surrounding area was divided up into half a dozen or a little bit, maybe more than that, different Roman provinces. There are different kinds of provinces. Some of them had kings, some just had governors, etc. And depending on the type of government and leader they had, the leaders had different kinds of powers and authority. So if you think the coast of the Mediterranean is here, um, down at the bottom you've got Egypt and Arabia and Idumea, where the Edomites lived. And then you've got Judea right above that, right next to the Dead Sea. And above Judea is, a region of Samaria. And above Samaria is Galilee. And across the Jordan River is a smaller region called Perea. That was between kind of east of the Dead Sea, going up about halfway up the Jordan River to the Sea of Galilee. And above Perea was a region called the Decapolis, which literally means 10 cities. And this was a group of 10 fairly large, mostly Greek cities in the area we now think of as Jordan and maybe southern Syria, a little bit within Israel. Galilee is at the very northern end of the modern state of Israel. And above Galilee and along the coast, next to Galilee, the Mediterranean coast, was the region of Syria. And Syria encompassed most of what we now know as Syria, plus the country we call Lebanon. Back then it would have been known as Phoenicia or something like that. So Syria was a mostly Greek area, culturally and linguistically Greek, but it had a significant Jewish population. The region of Galilee was mostly Jewish, but it did have, there were a lot of Hellenized Jews, and it was a kind of an international place. Centuries earlier, Elijah had called it Galilee of the nations, because it really was sort of a local melting pot. The predominant culture was Jewish, but with a lot of Greek influence. Especially the cities right around the Sea of Galilee had a lot of foreign residents. Samaria, below Galilee, the Jews thought of them as half-breeds and pretenders. They were people that the Assyrians had brought into the land of Israel to replace the native Israelites, plus a lot of native Israelites who had remained there after the Assyrian invasion. There was a lot of mutual hostility between these two groups, because even before Assyria, the Samaritans had their own center of worship. The kings of Israel had forbidden their people from going south to the temple in Jerusalem because they didn't want their loyalties divided. So they created their own temple, their own priesthood. And the Samaritans, the foreigners and native Israelites all mixed together, had carried on this tradition. Of course, Judea was the center of Jewish culture and religious life. This is where Jerusalem was, the temple was there. This was the headquarters of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Essenes. All of the important Jewish religious sects had their focus in Jerusalem and Judea. So this passage begins saying, "And he, Yeshua, went throughout all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. So his fame spread throughout all Syria, and they brought him all the sick, those afflicted with various diseases and pains, those oppressed by demons, those having seizures and paralytics, and he healed them. And great crowds followed him from the Galilee and the Decapolis, and from Jerusalem and Judea, and from beyond the Jordan." So Yeshua is traveling around his home base. I mean, the Galilee, Nazareth is in the Galilee. And Caesarea, where he kind of had his headquarters, was also there. It was on the banks or on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. So this was this was Yeshua's home territory. He began his ministry at home. He didn't start in Rome or in Jerusalem even. He started right there in his own neighborhood. Now, his cousin John had his ministry across the river in Perea, and at the end of this where it says, and beyond the Jordan, that's probably talking about Perea. I think this is really important, this idea that Yeshua started at home, because it's also important for us. You know, when Joseph's brothers came to Egypt, you know, Joseph was in the process of saving Egypt, but he set his brothers up first. He got them their own land, he got them their independence, and he provided for them. Then he went back to the Egyptians and saved the Egyptians. But he didn't give the Egyptians their own land. He taxed them so that he could give them their food back later, and he bought them as slaves for Pharaoh, while he kept his own brothers more free. And this is appropriate. We really should look out for those who are closest to us first. We should care for our own families. You don't take food out of your children's mouths in order to feed your neighbor's children, at least not if your children are starving. If you've got plenty, if you've got even more than you need, that's when you start sharing with others. You don't starve your children to feed somebody else's children. So Yeshua started in his own home region, but his own home region didn't really care for him all that much. You know, he had a following there. It says that great crowds followed him from these areas, but he didn't have the prestige, the fame in Galilee that he had in some other places. If you recall, there's an incident in Luke where he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth and he teaches there. And they say, hey, why are you healing people all over the country but not here? Why aren't you focusing here? Well, he was healing his own people. He started there, but they didn't have enough faith in him for him to really push his ministry as far as it could go in the Galilee, because they just didn't believe in him. They knew him. They were too familiar with him, or so rather they thought they knew him. They said, isn't this Joseph's son? How could he be a prophet or a miracle worker? So they just didn't accept it. But what about these other areas? Why didn't Judea accept him? And really, the crazy part is, why did Syria? It says that his fame grew in Syria, throughout all Syria. And the Syrians brought him their sick, and the demon-possessed, the afflicted, to heal. So the Galileans followed him around, but it was the Syrians who really believed in him. Not Assyrians, the Syrians. I think there are a few reasons for this. Samaria is an easy one. The Samaritans were hostile to the Jews, and the Jews were hostile to the Samaritans. So it's possible they hadn't even really heard of Yeshua yet. Later when he traveled through their territory, he certainly spent some time ministering to them and showed them love just like he showed everybody else. And they were astonished. But it's not surprising that they didn't hear of him early on and that his fame didn't spread there. I already talked about Nazareth. Now, Judea was experiencing three separate problems. The first problem is that they were having Messiah fatigue. Would-be Messiahs came and went all the time, and they always caused trouble. They always, stirred up conflict with Rome or with, the Herods or somebody. And so the people of Judea were very cautious about this kind of thing. They weren't going to embrace some guy as Messiah just because. So they were skeptical. And, that's reasonable. You shouldn't just accept everybody who comes along and says, I'm the Messiah, and especially not the ones who say we should overthrow our government. That'll really get you into trouble. But they also had a problem of their own entrenched authority. They believed that they knew everything, and they were the source of all wisdom and teaching. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, the scribes and the teachers of the law, these are the people who are supposed to teach. Who's this young whippersnapper from up in Galilee? He didn't go to any of our yeshivas. He's not one of us. He's not a Pharisee. At least not, he was in way more agreement with the Pharisees than you might think, but he wasn't really one of them. So they didn't accept him either. They were also very comfortable with Rome. They weren't looking for someone to, kick the Romans out at that time. There certainly were groups who were, but it wasn't the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They liked the way things were. They benefited from it. So I think there were really 3 reasons why Yeshua's fame spread in Syria, but not in Galilee and Judea. The first reason was this, cynicism, the Messiah fatigue, and we've got itinerant rabbis all over the place. What do we need another one for? Second was the threat to their power base in the peace with Rome. Syria didn't have that problem. There were a lot of Jews in Syria, but they weren't necessarily worried about an upstart Messiah, because if a Messiah came to Judea, well, Rome would just go there and punish those people. I mean, that wasn't always the case. Jews around the empire suffered persecution at times too. And sometimes a Messiah would cause problems all over the empire. But really, that was much more of an issue for Judea and Jerusalem. The Syrians didn't know Yeshua. They didn't have all the traveling preachers that the Jews had further south. And so when they heard about this guy in the Galilee, not in Jerusalem, but in Nazareth, in Caesarea, they thought, this might be something. There's something we should check out here. And so they sent people to find out, and news of Yeshua traveled throughout Syria. It's not something we read a lot about in Scripture. When the apostles began their missionary trips later, their headquarters became Syria for a while, Antioch in Syria. Now, of course, James stayed in Jerusalem, especially until after, the disciples, all the apostles stayed there, especially until after the destruction of Jerusalem. But until persecution really, after persecution really took off, the headquarters moved to Antioch. I mentioned 3 issues. The other one was over familiarity in the Galilee. They were faithless because they were too familiar with Yeshua, and they thought he knew who he was. And these are things that we all need to watch out for. We all need to watch out for being too comfortable in our own circumstances. God frequently moves us into places that are uncomfortable. Change and conflict are the things that help us to grow, and God wants us to grow. I'm not saying that we need to seek out conflict, but we shouldn't be afraid of the changes in the relationships that could be changed dramatically by learning and implementing the truth. We need to be careful that we're not too cynical. It's easy to become cynical when we hear all these preachers setting end times dates and saying it's right around the corner, and it never is. But someday it will be, and we need to keep an eye out for that. Messiah is coming back, and we're all going to know it when it happens. So don't be fooled by any would-be messiahs before then. You will know when Yeshua returns. But we also need to keep an eye out for all these other things, all the many antichrists. Don't follow just any traveling teacher. Be wary. Test them against the Scriptures. Test them against the Spirit. But don't be too cynical. Don't assume that every teacher and every person who claims to be a prophet is false. Sometimes they really are true. We also need to be careful about believing that we know the truth already. The people who lived in Galilee, especially in Nazareth, thought they knew who Yeshua was, but they were wrong. They didn't understand. He was not just the son of Joseph, he was the Son of God. And he was there to save the world, and not just the Jews, but the whole world from their sins. When Yeshua returns, we're going to be very surprised about who he really is, what he really expects from us. So, assuming that we already know everything, that we are the experts, that all of our doctrines, our church is the right church, the things that have been passed down to us century after century after century. I don't care how old your traditions are, how old your doctrines are, they could still be wrong. So be humble. Don't be too cynical. Be ready to change. These are all important things to being able to hear and follow God's plan for your life. This is Jay Carper from American Torah. Be blessed.